Hello everyone, my name is Adrian Marques and I'm the publisher and editor of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Optimizing Requirements Discovery. Today's featured speaker is Keith Ellis, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Alliances of IAG Consulting. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including a Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I would also like to say thank you to IAG for sponsoring this event. At this time, I will turn over to Mitch to get us started.
Thanks, Adrian. I appreciate that. And welcome everyone to Optimizing Requirements Discovery. Let me know if you can hear me just fine. And let's continue on the discussion. We have a very full agenda today. We're going to share with you some data and focus in on the needs of business analysts when you're trying to explain to people why is it so important what you're doing and what impact does it have within the organization. There's a lot of concern around that, around trying to make sure that people understand the importance of the overall requirements layer. And what we're going to do is show and quantify some of that for people and how it impacts, but then delve into some of the techniques that we use to get success. So there's certain ways you can go about peeling that onion back and driving it through. And finally, we're going to talk about driving change in your organization, because a lot of you are going to say, wow, those are really interesting, and how can we get that kind of success? But then how do you make those changes happen and get stickiness on those changes within the organization overall? So I'm probably going to try to run in around 45 minutes of content. So we'll make this as interactive as we possibly can. Even though we've got a whole lot of people on the line today, we'll make this as interactive as we possibly can. So stick your questions into the Q&A area. I'd encourage you to do that. If I don't get to your question during the session, every once in a while I get very, very long questions, and sometimes I can't get to them during your session. If I do get one or two that are like that, I may not be able to answer during the session, but I will commit to getting back to you by the end of the week with an answer. Okay, for sure I'll get back to you by the end of the week. So every question, make sure we get an answer for it, okay? So the learning objectives today are really to, let's get an executive perspective on making requirements change happen, because so many of you are trying to encourage change. You're perhaps frustrated with your own organization and the pace of change, or you're in the process of making change. You're saying, hey, look, how do I get greater executive buy-in? How do I get greater participation in that level of change within the organization? Because you're here to learn about optimizing requirements. Well, optimizing is, by definition, change-oriented. How do I continuously focus on and keeping this front and center? And let's talk about techniques for focusing in on and optimizing requirements discovery, and then the tactics of requirements competency development as you move forward, okay? A quick couple of slides on IAG, who we are and what we're all about as an organization. We're an organization that focuses exclusively on requirements definition and management. That's all we do in life, all right? And we will work with companies in one of four modes. We typically are engaged on larger scale projects where people come in and say, hey, this one's got 30 to 300 stakeholders, get a whole lot of use cases. We have to do it in a very tightly compressed period of time. Something drives them to want to go outside and have a professional analyst team come in and drive that elicitation. Or they could approach us and say, hey, look, we really like what you guys do. We really like the processes and practices. Can you improve our organization? And they bring us into, assess their basic organization, make improvement to their organization, implement our approaches to driving the requirements layer within the organization. They approach us to train their business analysts. We've trained maybe 20,000 business analysts over the years. Or sometimes it's just broken, and they need us to come in and do that outsourcing activity, which is transforming their organization and really making very significant change happen in a short period of time. But what underlies that big footprint is what I'll call elicitation, which is that ability to reach out and engage the stakeholders and ask the right questions at the right time to extract from them their business understanding, to be able to pull from them their business requirements where we are not, first and foremost, experts in their business per se. We're experts in the elicitation layer. And it's almost a religion around here that deliverables are clear, accurate, and complete. That's our focus in life. And we've actually been around for closer to 13 years now, done something like 1,200 projects. So we do a lot of this. And so what I'm going to share with you today is what we would use on projects regardless of the size. Okay, so whether we're dealing with something that's a little $500,000 project, I mean client-side spend, $500,000 slide, or whether we are dealing with something that is We're doing one now that's probably $80–90 million, and it's got something in the order of 120 stakeholders on that project. Whether we're doing one that, the smaller one or a very large one, you're still going to be using these same basic techniques that I'm talking about today during this session. And they're the same kind of techniques that we help implement at a lot of organizations to get significant change happen out there. Let's talk about making change, because I've mentioned that a couple of times in the introduction, and a lot of you out there are frustrated because, people understand that requirements are important, but they don't necessarily do anything as a result. They don't necessarily take action as a result, and it's sometimes difficult to get, very, very difficult, to get the executive focus and attention on the area to the extent that the area deserves, okay? And it's challenging and frustrating for people. It's kind of like weight loss, right? And then everybody understands that to lose weight, you gotta, eat less and exercise more. But we have an epidemic of obesity going on in North America today, and a lot of requirements is like that as well. People understand that they have to, if you're going to get good projects, you have to have great requirements. But executives tend not to do the eat less and exercise more. So how do you get their attention? And there's a couple of words in this slide that I want to draw people's attention to, because they're issues that you can adjust and address when you're dealing with that executive layer within the organization. Instead of requirements as a whole, you're talking in terms of projects and project success. And that requirements phase of projects is risky. So let's focus in on that word projects. And inconsistency to many executives, they understand that to be intuitively very expensive. So how can you deal with that? The facilitation excellence, part of engaging the stakeholders and being better at uncovering and adapting to and addressing stakeholder needs is extremely important. The whole idea of the broader process and process integration, process improvement. These are all things that you can start talking about that are more understandable than that word requirements, and will tend to give you a little bit better traction on making change within the organization. Now I'm going to ask in a minute to open up a poll, all right? And in fact, I'll open it up for everybody. And what I want to do is kind of get a sense of where everybody's coming from. And by the way, be candid. I'm not going to follow up on whether you are or not in a particular category, okay? But what I'd like to do is get a sense of where people are. Are you excellent in terms of requirements? And I'll spin my presentation a little bit that way. Are you about average? Are you poor? Be candid about where you are. And typically the numbers kind of come in a particular way, so I'm kind of expecting that. But be candid about where you are. And let me just open up the poll for a second here. If you're in a room with a lot of people in it, and that oftentimes happens, just take a quick poll in the room and say, okay, well, where do we think we are? Okay, here we go. I'm going to cut it off right about now. And I'm going to share with you the results. This is about the most normal-looking curve I've seen in a long time. Usually it's a little bit skewed toward below average. But I think what's happening here is that so many people have, over the last couple of years, made a tremendous amount of focus on improving the overall requirements practices that you're starting to see the curve move a little bit more toward average, and then you're going to start seeing people move beyond that as they spend more and more time working this. So I'm going to talk a little bit to the majority, which are in that kind of average or slightly below perspective, okay, and then continue to move on from there, okay? And yes, the presentation will be made available for download. Peter, you're asking that question. No problem. Send me an email to kls@iag.biz at the end, and that email address will be at the end. And I think Adrian will also have it on his site as well for the Modern Analyst participants as well. Okay, so it'll be in both locations. But if you make a request of me directly, I will get back to you. Now let me show you one of the reasons why I think people need to understand where you're at, because I think people tend not to understand that there's such a steep premium to be paid for poor quality requirements. And some of you may have seen this chart before. It's from something called the Business Analysis Benchmark. It's free, it's available, it's right on IAG's site at www.iag.biz, from something called the Business Analysis Benchmark. And what it says is that if you're poor at doing requirements, you're probably paying 60% more for your applications than the organization that's excellent in doing requirements. 60%. And the challenge that I would put out to the people who say, yeah, we're about average, is you're probably paying, that whole group is probably paying about 36% more for your applications than organizations that are optimal in doing requirements. And where I challenge you is, how many of you would pay 36% more for exactly the same car? How many of you would spend exactly the same, or 36% more for pizza even, right? But it seems to be, it's okay in the information technology world. And I think this is what analysts need to come together and understand, is that from an analyst's perspective, you are extremely significant in impacting the overall cost and timeliness of applications that are coming forward from the IT organization. You're extremely significant, and you play a significant role in that, in the overall timeliness of applications. And the quality of requirements are one of the most significant determinants of overall success. There's another set of statistics that comes out from, I think it was Gartner Group, a number of different organizations that said almost exactly the same thing. 70% of the time when a failure occurs, meaning you fail to deliver an application, you throw out something worth $100 million and you get nothing out of it. 70% of the time, it is the requirements that cause that failure. Now, Andrew, you'd asked the question about the factors that decide whether requirements are high or low. Probably the best document to look at for that is something called the Business Analysis Benchmark, the 2009 version of it, which describes requirements maturity in a whole lot of detail. But maturity is a much bigger issue, and I can pick it up toward the end if it comes back. Okay, if I get enough time at the end of the session, I'll pick that back up again. Now, let's take an example of this, all right? Because sometimes people say, well, okay, help me understand, like, what's this impact? How can it be that significant? Let's take an example. This is Michigan Department of Transport. It was an outsourced project, and what they asked us to do is they just picked one. They said, look, we want to test how this works in real life, okay? We want to see, okay, theoretically it makes a lot of sense, but let's try it. And so they asked us on a project called SafeStat, which is basically monitoring the progress of transport and safety projects. It's a $1 million initiative, $1 million client-side spend. And the first thing we did that they thought, oh, this is really interesting, is we were able to compress the requirement cycle into a 2-week interval, all right? Which they'd never seen that happen before, that you were able to get it down into such a tight window. Now, that's the first heavy lifting on getting the requirements. And now we had to go through the detailed requirement staging, and that takes about 10 weeks. So basically, from start to design, you're about 10 weeks in, all right? Then they released the RFP. So we helped them prepare and release the RFP. And the RFP went out, and the responses coming back from the domestic vendors are all plus or minus 30,000. So clearly, everybody understood what it was that they wanted to have built. It was very, very well understood. And secondly, the winning vendor, who's not listed above, it was able to use the precision requirements to secure performance guarantees. What that means is they said, we will deliver it on time, on budget, on function, or we will take on financial penalties. Now, how often do people approach their internal IT organization and say, here's a paragraph on what this project is. Can you give me a sense of how big that is? And then they hold people to that estimate and hold everybody very tightly to, well, this thing is way over budget, and you've not really even done proper estimation, proper requirements. In this case here, what happened is they came in 33% under budget. And they also had a very significant impact in terms of the reduction in ongoing maintenance costs, which is something that people tend to forget. Now, here's where you get the significant cost savings overall in terms of the mathematics of it. Most organizations, when they set out to spend $1 million on a project, many of them end up spending $1.5 million or $2 million. And in fact, the history of this particular organization was, if they budgeted $1 million, most of the time they would encounter some scope creep, and it would have pushed the cost to, on average, about $1.5 million. So instead of spending $1.5 million, they spent $700,000. Massive reduction in overall costs. And oh, by the way, instead of spending 20% maintenance on this the next year, they spent a small fraction of that. So it's a much different approach, is to have better understanding right up front. Now let's talk about a deep dive into our methodology, approach, deliverables, the way we structure this. And that way, I want to kind of share with you at the heart of what we do out there. And normally what I tend to like to ask is whether people like, you know, are you having issues when you're out there in your own methods and practices? Are you having issues in participation with the stakeholders? Are you having issues in consistency? Are you having issues in quality? Are you having issues in the speed and timeliness of getting requirements out there? And if that's something that you want to pop into the Q&A area, as I see these different issues pop up, I can talk to them as I go through the discussion. Now here's one of the things, so just use the Q&A area rather than the polling area. Here's one of the things that I want to kind of quickly address, and that's requirements are unlike any other business communication out there. They're radically different. Usually in business communication, what you have is it's a one-to-one relationship. It is one document produced by an author for a single audience, all right? One document produced by one author for a single audience. And then the reality is that in requirements, what you have is completely the opposite. You have many authors producing something which needs to service the needs of many audiences. And there are a lot of issues with that, because the issues are basically that you have to bring consensus to all. You can't have a process that disengages large segments of the community. You can't have a process that many members of the community don't understand. So, for example, UML modeling, wonderful approach to doing, you know, process elaboration. But people on the business stakeholder side tend not to understand it. They tend not to be able to look at it and have it immediately resonate for them. They tend to be more textual driven, right? So it creates its own set of problems that you need to start dealing with when you're dealing with this type of communication. You cannot disengage. You can't set a requirements process that disengages any of these stakeholder groups, because every single one of these stakeholder groups are absolutely essential. They're critical to setting requirements properly for the organization. So let's talk about how you do that. How do you design a process that's going to work for everybody? And part of that is to simplify, to focus on the what and not the how. First and foremost, focus on what the business wants to accomplish, not how it is to accomplish that in terms of an IT solution. When you separate those two, you begin to get a much simpler process for actually driving requirements. And secondly, I was talking about requirements. Now all of a sudden I'm talking about business process and process modeling. And people are starting to say, oh, wait a minute now, Keith, you just turned left there, and I thought you were going to go straight down the road here. The reality is when you're talking about business process and you're talking about business requirements are always bound to a business process. All right? As soon as you decouple the requirements from the fundamental, what is it that we are doing? What is it that the business physically does to transact certain things? As soon as you decouple those two, the requirements become unmanageable. All right? And you cannot maintain traceability in the requirement structure. You are always linking the requirements to the business process. So what you need to do is clearly describe that. Clearly describe that process. And so the way to kind of test that is to kind of come back to the rudiments of clear communication. All right? If I want to communicate clearly with somebody my actions, I am always going to be communicating in kind of this text, you know. Somebody does something with some information. I'm going to the newspaper to pick up a newspaper. No ambiguity there at all, okay? Somebody is doing something with some information. And so when you look at that, there are three basic legs of information or types of information that you're communicating in here. The person, somebody, the person of the system, does something, which is the verb, the process, with some information, the data, the noun, right? And what I would challenge you out there in the audience today, what I challenge you with is when you look at your way of defining requirements, are you today picking up those three fundamental legs of information? Do you describe the actor, the person, or the person interacting with the system and who they are, what they're about? Do you just, and do you know that the actor is changing at different states in the process? Does something, the process, do you describe the process? Do you describe how information moves in support of the process? And therefore, the rules are associated with that and the governance of those below that. Now, we call that scoping. All right, that's the very highest level of trying to set requirements, high-level requirements. It's just the very top level of that. And so what you're looking to do is you need a logical way of building out that information because, at the highest level, you're scoping and saying, somebody does something with some information, very high level, not rich, detailed definition of what's going on. So you need to go from that highest level down into detail and do that in a very logical, controlled, constructed way so that it works regardless of whether you're dealing with a little thing or you're dealing with something very, very large. So let's talk about a customer order information system, just for argument's sake, okay? Because many people, hey, you can order a pizza, or it's easy to visualize, right? So from a scoping perspective, what we ask, the first question is, what we're trying to do is determine the high-level scenario. So tell us the things that you do, all right? Tell us the basic processes that we're dealing with. And so you might have receive an order, price an order, fulfill an order, ship an order. And so you're really trying to drill down onto all of the things that people are into. And as soon as somebody says, well, that depends, then you know you've gone too deep, all right? Because now you're starting to deal with variations. And it's important to pick up the variations, but you're not trying to, at this level, capture them. And yes, Renato, the webinar slides will be available, and they're going to be on Modern Analyst, but you can also just request them directly of me, and I'll give you my email address at the end here, okay? The next thing we do is we do what's called a context diagram, and we do that context diagram because that's the other half of scope. There's the internal perspective on scope, which is what are the basic things that we do. The external perspective on scope is its context. How does this system that we're considering here, how does the process that we're looking at automating fit into the outside world? It's like when you deliver a new information system, it's like throwing a rock into a pond. It creates a whole series of ripples, right? You need to understand where those ripples are touching land, touching something outside the pond, which is the process. And where it does, it creates an interaction point, which either is automated or it's not automated. And you need to understand what those pieces are, right? And it does look like a rich mind map. It's actually a context diagram. The difference between a mind map and a context diagram, Andrew, is that these are external entities around the outside edge, and the information that you're sharing is what's listed on the line. Is what information is going back and forth. And the way you'd use it is you say, okay, well, I understand that these are the external entities that exist around this process. I'm interacting with the customers that are outside my institution. I'm interacting with the financial institution, third-party delivery company, and these other kinds of entities. Ask yourself the question. I see, okay, well, I see marketing on here is an entity. Is marketing, when they are interacting with the customer, obviously we have products in the catalog. Is that product catalog part of the customer order management system? Oh, no, it's not. Okay, fine. Well, it doesn't need to be. We just need to know that there's an interface to that type of thing. Well, how about promotions? Is promotions part of this? Because I need to communicate those promotions to the customer while they're doing their order. Oh, it is. Okay, fine. Let's make sure that we're dealing with that thing as we're defining the crimes. I see we've got a third-party dispatch thing here. Is the third-party delivery company, is the dispatch system itself part of this customer order management system? Oh, no, it's not. That's already built. It's something you just need to do. Okay, fine. So let's understand what it is. And what that does is it helps you to identify the rich interaction points that need to be automated. It also begins to help you understand the scenarios, right? So let's take one piece of this thing, the receive and order part, all right? What we were doing there is we were doing the scoping. So whether you were dealing with a simple system, which is a couple of weeks to go deal with it, or whether you're dealing with, we were doing one recently which had 160 use cases in it, business high-level use cases at that kind of level. Whether you're dealing with something like that where it might take 2 weeks to flesh out what are all these pieces, and that's an $80 million project. So you've got to basically define all these things. Now, at a high level, what you're looking to do is then take one of those pieces and begin exploding it. You say, well, how do I get from receive an order to price an order? What do I need to do? Give me an idea of the activities that you would take or do when you're doing that particular process of receiving an order. How do I get from trigger to outcome? And the person might respond, well, I got to verify the contact information, validate the customer, take and record the order, confirm the order, the basic set of things like that. Now you're starting to peel the onion, right? You're starting to understand really how this overall process begins to work. And going from receiving order, blah, blah, you start to get a process flow diagram, right, that begins to look something like this. Now the challenge that most people have is that they kind of stop at this level. They say, okay, geez, we put a tremendous amount of effort in, we really understand how this process works, but when you look at the individual boxes in your picture, I challenge you to look at your own pages in your own requirements document. Look at those little boxes that you have in your flow diagrams and say, could you build it? You got a box in here called validate the customer. Could you build it? And it's that difference between what I'll call black box understanding of your needs versus white box. Black box is, I've got an understanding that I need to validate the customer at this point in time, but I don't really understand how I'm going to do that. And in some cases, it's kind of irrelevant. So, for example, if you're doing an off-the-shelf purchase of a commercial application, you may not really need to know the details of how I'm going to validate the customer. You need to know some of those details, and that how the basic things that your organization typically looks at, and therefore you're going to look at how the system that you're contemplating on putting in puts it in, and therefore you're going to be able to align it. It's going to be easier to deal with. But if you're going to physically build this thing, you really need to know this in detail. Let's take the classic examples of Visa interface. It may be that you've identified that you're going to have a credit card processed. You don't need to know how that happens, just that it does happen. So it's black box versus white. So in this case, it's black box. To get to white box understanding, to get clear, accurate, complete requirements, you need to have conditions, constraints identified, the variations, the rules and policies, the data required in the process interdependency, and a real clear understanding what that process is. How do you validate the customer? And let me show you how you do this, because again, this is all about elicitation methodology, right? So about being able to not rely on your understanding of the process of the company, of your current existing process of the company, not being a subject expert, but being a subject expert in knowing the questions to ask, right? Because there's a simple set of questions that you can ask to elaborate this process. You can ask people, so if you're going to validate the customer, all right, I understand that you're going to verify the contact information, you're going to validate the customer, and then you're going to take the record of the order. So what information do you need to have? What information do you need to have to be able to validate the customer? Okay, so once you get that piece of information, so you need to know their phone number and you need to know their last name. Fine. Okay, so once they've told you their phone number and the last name, what do you do with that information? Oh, well, we put it, we check for existing contacts, we make sure that there's not a duplicate, and then we have to come back and every account has got a password, and they need to be able, so we use that information to identify the account, and then we've got to pull up their password, and then we wait for them to give us the password. Or maybe it's a financial system, and so you need to say, okay, well, we pull up that information, we then have the customer speak the password into our automated system, whatever it is, right? What's the normal outcome? What normally happens once that person has done that set of things, right? Well, normally the person's validated, or sometimes there may be multiple matches, or there may be a bunch of other things, right? Now, where do you get that information? So the information that you need to have access to is their file, et cetera, whatever. Where do you get that from? Because it may be that it's coming from HR. Maybe, so this is all about interdependencies. Like, who else needs to know that this is a valid customer? So you've ever been part of a call center where that call center, every single time you're handed to another person in the call center, you got to revalidate yourself, right? That's mildly annoying. So think about that set of 5 questions, 5 basic questions. What you're doing is, it's SIPOC. It's, basically look at the input-output process underneath the overall steps in a process. And that will help you uncover what needs to happen. So let's think about that validate the customer If you're going to validate the customer, you need to determine the detailed process. That process might be determine the customer exists. If they exist, then do this. If they don't exist, then do this. If there's more than one match, then you're going to display all the matches. You're going to do a sub-process that does this. You're going to validate the identity using blah, blah, blah. If there's, okay? Now, the question I have for you is, your goal is to get to complete, clear, unambiguous process, really understanding the interdependencies and the data requirements. Could you build this thing? Probably. Now let's talk about business requirements. Business requirements. The requirements are basically built right off of the process. There's a difference, though, between, say, a use case, which is what you're seeing on the left, and what you've got on the right. The requirements are the gap between the current state and the to-be state. That's the requirements. It's what you don't have. So if it's a totally greenfield thing, then the requirements are the process. If there's an existing system in place, then the requirements are the subset of process. That's the change, okay? Now, the question I'm going to ask is, can you build it? Is it clear? And clearly, obviously, this is not as detailed as it could be, right? Because I'm trying to get it all down on one slide. But certainly, the point of the exercise is that it's much clearer. You're much more focused on the basic mandatory functionality that must exist in order for somebody to actually build that system. And you're achieving it in a very structured way. So a quick review, okay? A quick review is to come down through the business requirements modeling, and you say, okay, let's talk about the business need. The first thing we focus in on is the overall business objectives, and we spend a reasonable amount of time looking at those business objectives and making sure people understand them. Because if you're going to prioritize requirements later on, if you're going to use and keep the focus in the meetings on keep the meetings clearly focused, you need to get a better understanding of that business need and the objectives. Then we go through the context model and the high-level scenario, which is that scoping piece. When you look at the high-level scenario, the words in each sentence are composed of nouns and verbs. The nouns are the entities. The verbs are the activities. And the verbs, we typically use a use case structure to explode it out. Now, we could be using a user story structure, a whole bunch of other structures to kind of explode it out. The nouns, you're taking through conceptual data modeling exercise, defining the entities, defining the elements that are being used, defining the entity relationships that are being used, etc. And all of those, together with the business rules, create the functional, non-functional data requirements, design considerations, etc. Okay? All of those together. Somebody at Reshma, you're asking about what percentage of time should be spent in each state. Here's a very rough rule of thumb, okay? For every hour that we would be spending scoping, meaning doing the very, very front end, typically on $1 million assignment, we do a lot of that just over the phone, and you're probably 2, maybe 3 hours, okay, in total. You would probably spend 10 times that in the facilitation. So, if you're, 5 to 10 times that. You'd spend, for every 1 day in scoping, you're probably 10 days in actual facilitated session filling it in. The scoping activity is just to get all of the pieces mainly identified. And then between that step and really fleshing it out into extremely detailed requirements that are ready to go build, you're probably 3-to-1 ratio, okay, to the actual high-level requirement stage. If that's very, very rough rule of thumb, and that depends on the actual assignment that you're working at a particular point in time, right? Because you may not need to go down to detail requirements or all of the detail. If you're doing, say, a cost implementation, you may keep it up a level and then run your RFP and everything like that off of the level of requirements that I've just been sharing with you today, right? And yeah, Christina, all of this does get captured in a BRD. You would have the process flow and the data flow and the structured statements of business requirement together in that same document so that you're continuously presenting the requirements in the context of what the business wants to accomplish. And that way, it's very, very tight, okay? Let me give you an example, and this is a global food manufacturer. It's actually an SAP implementation, and what they were trying to do is go from order to delivery in 7 days, from 7 days down to 36 hours. Now, I don't care who you are. You can't get food moved across the United States in 36 hours. So the concept here is that as soon as the retailer calls and says, I need to order such and such an amount of food for such and such a location, the food already has to be on the truck and going to that location. So think about that in terms of the magnitude of change. And this is a global, very, very well-recognized brand. So what you're talking about is transform everything from supply chain, traffic and transport, CRM, production and planning, forecasting, marketing, sales operations, etc. Now, the challenge people have with the prior discussion that I've just had was people say, wow, that's a lot. That's huge. It's big. It's all-encompassing. But the reality is that when you take that much more structured approach, you're really engaging the business stakeholders at the business level, right? You're engaging the executive at the executive level, talking about what are these major areas that are impacted. You're engaging the management at the management level, saying, how is your one area going to physically function? In this case here, what we're able to do is within 2 weeks with a very senior team, we were able to carve this, I think it was $800 million project down into 12 very specific things, projects that needed to be run. And we drove those through very, very quickly, right? Each one of those was 1 to 3 weeks of iteration, uncovering all of the interaction areas. So here's the basic process for how this thing works. Based on what we're trying to accomplish here, what are the things that are most impacted by this desired state of 7 days down to 36 hours, and then begin elaborating each one of those down in some degree of detail so that you could drive them through much more significantly, okay? In fact, Andrew, you're asking a question. It seems subjective. It depends on fixed time, fixed cost, or time and material. In fact, no. What we have are very defined states as to what constitutes complete or incomplete. And the only way you're able to do that is if you're running a more iterative approach where you're breaking out scoping into a particular layer with certain information sets, requirements into a certain layer with certain information sets, and then detail requirements or RFP or whatever your next layer of requirements is to a specific layer to a specific set of information. Okay? Let's talk about elicitation, and this is bordering a little bit on Stephanie's question around the roles of documentation and the analysts and what they play in this whole thing. So thank you for asking that one question. When we talk about requirements, people will tend to think about it as a document. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to visualize in your head the requirements that were produced, the requirements in your last strategic project. Think about it in your head, the requirements that were produced in the last strategic, the requirements in your last strategic project. Most of you, what happens is, what you visualize in your mind is a document, and you can almost feel the heft of it or lack thereof, right, in your mind. But requirements are not a document. Requirements are a process, and that process is either great or it's poor. The artifact of that process, which is the document, if the process was lousy, how likely is it that the document that is the artifact of that process, how likely is it that that's going to be fantastic? Very unlikely, right? If the process for getting the requirements is excellent, how likely is it that they're going to be excellent? So you need to rethink. People tend to be very documentation-centric. Just fill in the darn template and we'll be fine. But the reality is it's not the result so much that matters. It's the journey that matters. It's how did you go about doing that. So you've got to leverage the requirements. This is a curve, the success curve, success ratio curve on a survey that we did back in 2008. Just general success rates, okay, on projects. So 12.8% failure, most of them ending up as neither successful nor unsuccessful. If you had excellent elicitation, let's separate out those ones that had excellent elicitation on that project. Boom. Radically different, right? The ones that uncovered the interdependencies, that were very good at getting at unambiguous goals and objectives, that had quality facilitation sessions, made efficient use of stakeholder time, and completed in a short period of time, those ones were far better, far more efficient, and had a far higher success rates. So think about that elicitation skill and start looking at that and saying, well, how can you better improve that? And yeah, Bill, there is a template up on my website that you can go grab from www.iag.biz, and you can basically pull that and say, you know, just take a look at the structure of that particular template, or you can participate in Inside Effective Business Requirements Documentation, which I think we're doing with Modern Analyst. Adrian helped me out in a week or 2 weeks or something like that. Let me give an example of this elicitation capacity that I'm talking about here, okay? This is a global insurer, and they've been working on re-engineering their organization for about 18 months, and we were brought in actually by the re-engineering company because they're just unable to get down to a level of detail that they needed to. And what they were trying to do is they'd grown by acquisition, so they had something like 12 divisions, 12 separate brands. Each of them had their own set of systems, and they couldn't roll up a single view of the customer. So if I said, okay, Bill's got what policies with my organization, he's got this one with this brand, this one with this brand, this one with this brand, and the total book of business across all brands is this amount, okay? Couldn't do it, just was totally unable to do it. And they've been working on it for about 18 months. And so the difficulty is that the devil's in the detail. You need to drive it down to a level of specificity that all of a sudden becomes very clear to people what it is that you're trying to accomplish and how to go about building that. And that's where typical reengineering breaks down, is it doesn't really connect the grassroots of how this is done in very, very granular levels of detail that you need to be able to systematize something. So in this case here, what we were doing is we were working a small team on our side, like 4 literally people on our side. I think this project is something in excess of 100, 200 million. So 4 people on our side working together with 12 divisions on their side to drill down to a harmonized process and data model. So we took the reengineering at the starting point and then layered in all of the detail required to flesh out that model. And then what we did is we compressed the cycle of elicitation for each of those dispersed communities, because you're running across a lot of different geographic patch at this point in time, running 2 different concurrent teams and 2 different geographies to basically make it up, and then bring this thing back on board, which is 4 weeks to get to the business model, presenting this to the board of directors, 12 weeks beyond that to get to the longitudinal data and process model, and then 16 weeks beyond that, you're presenting to the IT organization ready to build use cases that people can take away and actually physically begin doing coding on that. Let's talk about making effective change, all right? And the first thing that I can share with you is how we do it ourselves, because whether you want us to help you do it or you do it yourself, you still got to replicate many of the things that IAG has in its DNA. And part of the DNA starts with just the way we go about hiring and building the skill sets of our people, right? It starts with every consultant being consistent. We're kind of like McDonald's in here. You know, every burger going out the door is the same. Why? It's because essentially our clients are extremely unforgiving. We have to have that rigorous competency development that, you know, we've defined, I think it's like 13 steps or in the process of hiring somebody that we identify and do that resume screening, et cetera. But then once we've brought those people on, through that resume screening, there's a 2-hour assessment of skills that we do. There's an online course that they have to take, and they need to score above a certain level in that course. They then go on to a 1-week boot camp with our organization, and that 1-week boot camp is really determining not only do they have the basic skills, but do they have the aptitude to take in new knowledge and then be able to apply that in the face of a customer and mock engagements. Now, once they've gone all that, they're not actually ready to go out on engagement with us. They're actually ready to go out and observe our consultants who are doing those tasks on engagements. And I challenge you to say, well, what is it you're putting into your own staff? Are you doing that level of rigor? And then beyond that, what we have are sort of specializations. So when people come in, they come into certain roles. As they move from where they're talking to the next series of roles, they specialize and they go through another layer of certification to acquire those skills. And each of those roles are tied to specific services that we turn around and offer to clients and satisfaction metrics that we measure when they're out there dealing with that. So for yourself, you need to define something similar if you're going to make significant improvement. And then you need to think about improvement as not just training, and meaning course delivery. Course delivery is one part of the whole thing, right? If I'm dealing with this kind of way of change, most people think about this stuff over here, right? They think about, I need people to attend and do coursework, I need to do self-study and evaluation, and there's some framework that I'm dealing with. Instead, what you need to think about is that experiential learning, which is this frame over here, right? It's all about how do I build up people's individual level of experience with this? How do I get them to apply that knowledge? Because you're going to go from simply delivering the understanding to helping people to internalize it, and then this down in here is helping to institutionalize that understanding within the organization. And what that does is it forces you through combining on-the-job training with coaching and mentoring. It forces you into a multi-level accreditation, and that concept of saying not every analyst in here is doing exactly the same thing and offering exactly the same services through to my customers who are your internal customers, right? And trying to change out that structure of working together within your organization. So there's 4 golden rules, okay, for making change. Because many of you are tasked, and by the way, the statistics on this and the level of change people have made are all in the Business Analysis Benchmark 2009. I'd encourage you to go out onto our site and take a look. There are 4 golden rules in my experience. I've been doing this, I don't know, a whole lot of years, I guess. And there's certain things that people tend to do the same, and I'll suggest a few things to you, okay? Never underestimate the difficulty in making change. Ever. Never, ever, ever underestimate the difficulty in making change. People will tend to think, okay, I need to make improvement in my overall ability to do requirements, and then they'll say, okay, well, let's just bring in some training, and we'll do a week's worth of training, and that's going to, no, it's, you know what, it'll do some good things for you. It'll help motivate your people, it'll help give them some very specific techniques, but if you're trying to do wholesale transformation on the order of 60, 70, 80% improvement in productivity, there's more involved in it than that. It's the whole maturing of your organization that you need to be focusing in on, which is, I think somebody else had asked me, Krista, you'd asked me a little bit about that. So maturing your organization is much more than simply training individuals. In fact, highly skilled people in a low maturity organization will vastly underperform lower skilled people in a high requirements maturity organization. People do need to experience a new process to understand how that process is different. I could tell you till I'm blue in the face about how working requirements within our organization, we execute within these windows and in this period of time and to this level of quality. But until you've physically done one with us, it's very hard to get the head around just how fast this is, the pace, the tempo, the clarity that you get as a result of doing it that way. People tend to sit back and say, oh my God, I can't get all of those people in a room and lock them there for a week or 2 weeks, or in the case of one that we did recently, 3 months, right? People say, I can't achieve that, right? And the issue is that you can. But what it requires is that you have much, much, much better requirements planning to set stakeholder expectations and to negotiate the availability of individuals with your organization. And elicitation excellence is critical, but it does take time to build. You know, it's a career-limiting step to stick an inexperienced analyst in front of a senior set of executives and say, hey, have at it, right? It's career-limiting to that individual. You want to build it in a safe way. You want to build it rigorously so that when they do step up in front of those executives, they do get systematic and significant improvement. And by the way, remember how we were talking about before how requirements basically, if they're poor, 60% additional cost and time associated with it? What we looked at is overall maturity, and this particular chart caused me to go back in and look at this and take another complete study. But what we found is, if you look at the maturity levels of organizations, the more mature the organization becomes across the board, the higher the success rates of that organization. And the larger the project,
the steeper that curve gets. So you're radically offsetting your overall failure rates. In fact, we did a complete study in 2009 which focused exclusively on this. Help define for me what is a mature organization and what does that look like and what are its components. So here's another case study, a North American bank. And this one here I think had 400 analysts or something like that, and they asked us to come in and help them do the transformation, the build out of the entire process and the templates and the course curriculum and the licensing of methodologies and all sorts of stuff. But what was most important in here is that they also worked with us and engaged together to help them internalize this into their organization, which is a completely different set of things that people tend to ignore, they don't think about, is that whole set of simulations and assessment testing and accreditation and et cetera that reinforce the learning. Now, a couple of final slides here, and I can pick up a few questions that I didn't pick up along the way. There's a secret sauce, and people ask me that, hey Keith, what's your secret sauce in your organization? And whether you're coming to us and we're providing that capability or you're building it yourself, you do need to have this within your own organization, right? So if you're setting about to make improvement and optimize requirements within your organization, you need these capabilities. And it starts with expert facilitators, people who are able to engage the stakeholders, ask the right questions at the right time, and proactively pull people through a process of requirements. And those people do need to use a superior process, something that is founded to be superior. They can't just wing it and hope that it's going to be good, and person number one and person number two are not doing it the same way. You have to change that, right? You have to have tight quality control. You need to know what good requirements are and what they are not. And it needs to operate in an accelerated environment. One of our great determinants of success is that we typically are compressing requirements by 60, 70%. So you're not taking as long in meetings. You're achieving, well, the reengineering of, say, unemployment insurance tax benefit for a consortium of states in some magnitude project like that in months rather than over a year, right, to get the requirements sorted out. We also do a couple of other things that you may be interested in. That's consolidating consensus with real-time documentation. What that means is if we're facilitating a session between Monday and Friday, on Friday that documentation is released out to the client for review. And what that does is it forces people to get into that review process while the whole conversation is still fresh in people's minds, while it's still real time. If it's completely offline, and the greater the lag between the sessions themselves and the documentation coming out, the more change you get and the more difficulties you have. So you got to significantly reduce the rework overall in the process, in the project. So why is that important? Look, you can radically reduce the amount of change that happens on projects. And so we measured this some years ago. And we said, look, let's take IAG and its RDP, which is the requirements discovery process, which is our methodology, and we compared it to whatever they were working on or using today in their project. And we did this at 6 client sites across 36 projects, paired analysis, which says take 2 projects of roughly equal size, do whatever you want on one, use our approach on the other, and let's see what happens. And what we found was that the change to requirements compressed. It reduced by 75%. It's not that it can't change. What happened is that it tended not to change. That's the kind of thing you need to achieve within your own organization. And it's only achievable by looking at beyond the template. Look at the process, the techniques that you're using, the staff and the competencies and how you build that within your organization, the technologies that you've got in place. Look at the organization and your services and how you're constructing, how you're managing and harvesting those skills. And then, yeah, you do need to look at the templates and the documents that you're using on the way through. So finally, some discussions of next steps. Certainly, if you have questions, give me a call. I would encourage you all to go onto the IAG site, take a look at all of the assets that are there and available, including some of the templates and tools and downloads that people are asking.
Hey, Keith.
If you're interested in an effort, give me a call. We can have a conversation about that. And then finally, on the last slide here.
Keith?
Yes.
I think you lost your slides. I'm not sure if you dropped off the actual
Hang on, let me just
webinar
reset.
itself. Yeah, just a reset.
I'm on the thank you slide anyway here.
Okay, no problem.
Let's try that again. See if it'll reload. You know what? We're having a couple of technical difficulties here, but you can. An error occurred. You've disconnected from the webinar. Please rejoin. Is still there, audio?
Yep.
Okay, so it looks like it's dropped the slide. I'm not sure exactly how to fix that. But what I can do is just pick up whatever questions people have. Adrian, if you can just read them to me because it's dropped me out of the interface.
Yeah, I think the last question was Bill's question. It said, do you have a good requirements template? I understand you saying it's a process, but I need something that helps me drive output to the process.
Sure. Bill, just send me that in an email, and I can turn around and send you a couple of samples. But the other thing I can do, and certainly if people are interested in specific examples of ideas like this, there's a lot of templates and examples on our site, including the template that we physically use when we're going out on engagement. So send me that in a note, and I will turn around and send it to you. Otherwise, if you go up into iag.biz, there's a lot of samples and examples there as well. If you just want to do it without directly contacting me, okay, that's easy enough for me to deal with. We've got a bunch of them around. Are there other questions that are there? There's about 20 or 30 in the interface there, so.
Yeah, let me see. There is some earlier question that they were asked about getting to the percentage of time to be spent
Yep.
on every phase of the requirements process, doing understand the requirements, understand the
Sure.
processes.
So the ratio in there is about, for every $1 you might spend in scoping, you're going to spend about $10 in the actual getting the business requirements done, and then you're going to elaborate the business requirements to detail requirements, and the ratio of the two prior stages to the last one's about 3 to 1 ish.
Great. I don't see any other questions. Let's see. Take a look at this. Here's what are the 2 rules in the 4 rules for making change in the business area of requirements?
Oh yeah, because only 2 were showing on the screen at the time.
Right.
Yeah, only 2 were showing on the screen at the time. So really, it's never underestimate the level of change that's involved in making change within your organization. I mean, it's a little motherhood and apple pie, but the reality is that people try to make change all the time, and they're not able to physically drive it within the organization. The next thing is you need to experience the process. The third one is you can get the stakeholders together, and the last one is the elicitation excellence takes time to build. So the last 2 are really all about getting the stakeholders together. Tends to be a phobia of analysts who have very poor elicitation capability within their organization, and that they'll tend not to run cross-functional meetings. They'll tend to do sequential interviewing to find the requirements, and that process will take 3, 4, 5 times longer than running cross-functional meetings more successfully. So you can change up your process and radically compress the overall amount of time it takes to get requirements. And then the last one is, but elicitation excellence does take time to go build. You can turn the Q&A over to me again. By the way, I've managed to come back in.
Okay. I think there's one more while I do that. There is another question from Bill asking, in terms of traceability, what are you tracing the requirements to?
Okay, so traceability functions in a number of different ways. So traceability runs in the context of, sorry, I'm just distracted briefly as I'm trying to show the application here. Can you see this now?
Yes, Keith.
Okay, so let me just pop to the last slide here so people can see this. There we go. So traceability happens in a number of different ways. Usually traceability, what's most important about it is that you maintain the contextual understanding for the stakeholders when you're going from one state of requirements understanding to the next, to the next, to the next. So if you're going from business requirements to detail, from detail to system design requirements, from system design to, et cetera, all the way through the process. And when you're going from testing and actually testing the requirements, that you're testing the requirements physically rather than testing, what the software designers built. So it's that contextual understanding that you're most concerned about with traceability. The second aspect of traceability that's important to kind of further define it is you are maintaining traceability for the sake of doing impact analysis. So in the face of requirements change, that you're able to actually assess what impact that change will have. So oftentimes in our world, what we're using are tools. So we might use RecPro as a tool to manage some of that traceability. We might use, if we're UML modeling, we might use other modeling tools to deal with that, Enterprise Architect, et cetera, to manage that traceability matrices, and all these other kinds of things. But you're typically managing it. The most critical is to maintain the context of information. And then secondly, you're typically using it to manage the impact analysis associated with change. And then finally, the downstream stuff, when you're dealing with testing and things like that, it's important to have the traceability in place. Let me just see if I can pull this out. Now I can rate it. Okay. Yes, if you want, I got a lot of questions here, people asking me for the templates. If you do want templates, send me a note and I will turn around. Because I get about, I hate to say it, I get about 200 email a day. So sometimes I don't remember to get tasks that come out of a webinar like this, and I can't see your email addresses. So send me a note with a request for a template if that's what you're interested in. Bill, hopefully that's answered your question with respect to traceability and the requirements. Now, when you're talking about requirements, I think in the context of your question, typically what you want to do is associate the requirements with the process. So there's a degree of connection between the requirements and the process on the way through. How do you manage scope if you're working in iterative terms? Andrew, the best way to manage scope if you're working in iterative terms are really to make sure that each of the passes have equal fidelity of information. And what that means is that you're looking for a certain type and depth of understanding of a certain information. And then the next pass through, when you're doing the requirements, you're taking getting to the next depth of information. So the first pass through, you might say, okay, what are all the basic use cases in here? The next pass through, you're going to say, okay, we need to elaborate all of those use cases to the activity level. Then the next pass through, you might be saying, okay, we need to go down to the tasks in each of these activities and elaborate those tasks in the activities. So you're controlling it in a little bit different way. You're not trying to go to the nth level of detail in one very narrow area. You're running in passes. And the reason you're doing that is it allows people to maintain better contextual understanding of the overall thing. No, Paul, the BRD delivered by IAG is not really a hybrid between a functional requirements document and business requirements. We really try to separate out the business requirements from functional. We talk to the business process. We include in it, here are the requirements, meaning structured statements of system capability, right, which people call functional requirements. But we would have a next level down in detail, which is really the elaboration of those requirements to fuller software-related requirements. Okay, so then typically that's what people are separating out. Andrew has the same question, which is what's the difference between a BRD and an SRS, which is software requirement specification. The differences are really the business requirements are much more oriented on what the business wants to accomplish in business terms. Software requirements in an SRS are really much more software specification. They're much more IT-related terms. And some big differences will be things like the reusable components that are in there. From a business perspective, when they're describing their business terminology and describing a business process in whatever the terms, you have no idea what's going to pop out, right? So you need to take another iteration where you separate out all those concepts that are reusable or includes functionality, et cetera, into their own thing. Then you need to typically refactor those use cases into a new structure which better organizes the use cases, right? Because you don't know, when somebody says, you know, file an order, you don't know how complex that whole process is until you really get into it and you understand, you know, get into it in detail, understand what it is. So all those kinds of things have to happen, right? Then you take it into a format which is more component-oriented when you start delivering the SRS. And I understand, yeah, I'm running a little bit over time. But I did want to, you know, take out the pregnant pause. We've got a whole lot more questions popping into the interface. I will come back and make sure that I answer all of these questions for everybody on the way through. But with that, I wish you all great success. Cheers. Back over to you, Adrian.
Hey, thank you, Keith, and thank you for everyone who attended this very informative webinar. Sorry for the little technical difficulties at the end, but we're going to post, as Keith was saying, the slides in the webinar after the event, so you can access, again, the information on the slides that you may have missed. Again, I want to point out again, one more time, the webinar along with the slides will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com. Within a few days, you can send an email to Keith as well, and his email is right there on the screen. Thank you again for attending today's event. This concludes our session. We hope you have a fantastic day.